Hello friends, the topic of today's discussion is tourism strains and thresholds. In our earlier lecture, we talked about this kind of an aspect relating to tourism, where we talked about that how tourism is integral to the economy of a country and how it is able to generate a lot of money within the country, and at the same time a lot of foreign exchange is also generated when tourists from other parts of the world they are visiting these tourist places. So one has to keep in mind that tourism definitely is an important concern in the economy of a country, but at the same time one has to also see the environmental concerns as well, and how tourism creates a lot of strains and thresholds in the framework that when these kinds of strains they are being created, then some kind of appropriate measures they have to be undertaken in the context of saving the environment as well. And we have seen that how over a period of time, because of the influx of the tourists, there is some kind of a toll on that particular region. In the last lecture we also talked about certain regions. We talked about Andaman and Nicobar. We also talked about Agoda, which was a place, a seaside village in Goa, and how because of the construction of the hotels in this particular place Agoda, which in a way affected it negatively. We also talked about the Andaman and the Nicobar Islands, that how because of the too much of tourist influx, the coral reefs and other kinds of the natural features of Andaman and Nicobar they got affected, and how the tribes which are living in these regions they were also being affected because of the influx of the tourists. And many a times you have seen that how the tourists, those who are visiting in these places, they are not very careful in the context of preserving the environment. And we also talked about the places like Ladakh, that how it was also in a way more and more people were visiting and creating that kind of a problem. We also talked about in the framework of the regions like Nepal, where we find that the Everest also experienced that 200 kilos of garbage was being taken out from there. Then we also talked about that how some kind of sanctuaries in different regions, wildlife sanctuaries, they are being affected because of the pressure which is being created due to the tourist influx as well. Then we have seen that in Kumaon and Garhwal also how some kind of a direct devastation was being caused because of the grazing land, and the good forest area it was being taken away because of the tourist development. And we have seen that more and more buildings, when they are being created in these regions, then these buildings many of them they are not even useful because not many people are visiting these regions sometimes. And when you create more and more buildings, then they create a lot of problems, keeping in mind the ecosystem and the kind of balance which is there, the environmental balance in these regions. So we see that how the tourism, it destroys the tourism in that sense. We can see the plight of the hill stations when more and more people are visiting these regions, and because of the short-term socio-economic problems, uncontrolled tourism is taking a lot of toll in the context of the environment. So when you talk about these kinds of thresholds, because the tourism is an industry no better or worse than other industries, and if one believes industry is what development is about, one will support tourism. But it is very important to understand environmental thresholds in the context of tourism, for these must demarcate the pathways which future growth of tourism has to traverse. So in that context, the thresholds are very, very important. And we find the three significant components of such a threshold: increasing population, increasing exploitation of the natural resources, and increasing population, all of them. So pollution, natural resources and population, all of them they have to be taken into account, and if these are not properly and timely managed, then they will cause catastrophic destruction to our nature or the ecosystem. And how these aspects are also very, very interrelated in that context, that when there is more and more pollution, whether the air pollution, water pollution or the sound pollution, then the human beings they will be devastated in the long run. Then when we are exploiting more and more natural resources, then we find that over the period of time we will not be left with those natural resources. So what we have to do is the systematic exploitation of the natural resources should be done, and they should be done in such a sustainable manner that over a period of time we are able to replenish our resources in such a manner that they continue for our succeeding generations as well. And when more and more population is there, then there will be a lot of pressure on the land as well, or on the resources. So the population increase should also be commensurate in that sense, that the resources are available for the entire population. And many times it has also been argued by some of the social scientists that increasing population, if it is in the range of the working population, then it is good for the economy. But one has to also see that when, even if it is a working population, it is good for the economy, but one has to also see in the framework of the environment, because if you have higher population, then this population would also need various kinds of resources, and these kinds of resources, if they are not available in the economy, and if they are available in lesser numbers, then they will create a lot of pressure on the economy. So when one is talking about pollution, tourism can no longer be separated from other man-made disruptions of ecology, such as mining and deforestation. And we find in developing countries there is an additional unsavory twist, because there is imbalance in the power between the rich tourists from the industrialized world and the poor who service their needs virtually guarantee the exploitation of the natural resources. So the scale of tourism development in relation to the carrying capacity of the environment greatly influences the extent of the environmental impact. So we find that when one is talking about these kinds of concerns, and how the poor as well as the rich, those who are living in these regions, they are affected in different manners by the kind of influx which is happening. So we find that many of the types of the impacts considered can result from the various types of development, and the most are not unique to tourism. And if these impacts are not checked, they are on the thresholds of creating an ecological imbalance. And when one is talking about pollution, we find that in the tourism industry, the pollution can be of different kinds. For example, water pollution, if a proper sewage disposal system has not been installed for the hotels, resorts and other tourist facilities, then there may be pollution of groundwater from the sewage. And if a sewage outfall has not been adequately treated, effluent will pollute water area. And the garbage generated by tourists near the water bodies is another important concern. So we find that water is an important concern, and there is a lot of problem with regard to even the drinking water facilities in different regions of India. And if it is not managed well, and whatever water is available with us, even that is polluted, then it will create a lot of problem for the people, those who are living in these regions. And because of the water pollution, we will find that not only the natural flora and fauna will be affected, but also the human beings, they will be affected because of the water pollution. And when we find that there are a lot of effluents in the polluted water, and because of which severe kinds of medical problems can emerge in the human beings, those who are living in these regions. Apart from that, we also find that not only in these regions which we have a lot of tourist inflow, but across India, in many cities of India, we find that there is a lot of air pollution, and because of which we find that when more and more tourists they are visiting these regions, then there is a lot of pressure on the vehicles which are being run in these regions, which also creates a lot of air pollution. And we find that when you are using cars, buses and motorcycles in these regions, so the excessive use of internal combustion vehicles which are being used for the tourists in these areas, they create problems of environmental pollution in the context of air. And the pollution is also in the form of the dust and the dirt which is there in the air, which may be generated from the open devegetated areas if tourist development is not properly planned, developed and landscaped, or is it an interim state of construction. So we have to look into all these kinds of aspects, because air pollution is one of the major concerns of our times, because of which a number of diseases they are also being generated. People, they are scared to go out because of the air pollution many a times, and if the people, those who are going for even for their walks, then they find that all sorts of problems with regard to their breathing they also develop. Especially the younger children and the old age people, they experience a lot of problems during the times of winters, etc., when the situation becomes comparatively more worse. Apart from that, we also see that there is a concern of noise pollution. Noise is generated by the airplanes and the motorboats, and the noise by the amusement parks, they reach the uncomfortable and irritating levels for nearby residents and the other tourists as well. And these pollution are of lesser harm to human beings, as we can use safeguards as well, but from these rest of the biosphere also suffers. So we find that how noise pollution again is an important concern of our times, and we find that not only airplanes and the motorboats, they are creating it, but the amusement parks which are being which are being built in so many tourist areas, they are also an important concern for the masses. And these kinds of pollution, we find that they may be lesser or harmful in that context for the human beings. So in a way, we can use some kind of a safeguard to prevent the noise pollution. But at the same time that human beings, they can do such kinds of safeguards, but rest of the biosphere definitely suffers from such kind of things. Then we also find that population definitely has got a very important bearing over our ecosystem for its various requirements of the basic survival. And food is basically provided or grown over earth, which needs protection from overexploitation. And for shelter, landscape is required, but increasing population is making availability of space a difficult kind of a proposition. So we find that if the space is not available in that sense, so that the population can be in a way placed in these regions, and then it becomes some kind of a problem for that particular population and even for that area. So we find that because of the rising urbanization, because of the rising population, we find that more and more urbanization is taking place, more houses they are being built. So we find that the agricultural lands, they are being converted into the residential areas, and agricultural lands, they are shrinking, and the forest areas, they are also shrinking because of the indiscriminate human activity. And generally it has been argued that ideally one third of a country's region, they should be the agricultural or they should be in the forest areas. Then not agriculture, but they should be in the forest areas. But when you see in the practical frame of mind, we practical purposes, we find that because of encroachment even in these forest areas, we find that we are not able to meet that target, and largely the target remains comparatively lesser. So this kind of an imbalance between the requirement of the forest areas and the kind of the people, those who are there, those who are living, so that creates some kind of an imbalance in the ecosystem as well. So we find that how the world needs more land for the agricultural production, and simultaneously land is also required to provide houses for the common men. So we find that technology provided a better living in form of the synthetic fibers, plastics, inorganic pesticides, leaded fuels, and many other products, and how they cause the introduction of the toxic and the biologically active materials into the environment. So how all of them, they are creating some kind of havoc on the environment, and when the environment will not be sustained, then it will be very difficult for the human beings to sustain themselves as well. And when one is talking about that how the pollution in the land, air and water, they are being increasing day by day, and because of the chemical waste and the chemicals. So we find that the natural mechanisms of the detoxification of the pollutants and of adjustment to their effects were overwhelmed by these inputs. And one of the important concerns is the greenhouse gases, that how the basic atmospheric processes are being modified by the massive urban industrial discharges of the greenhouse gases. And because of the greenhouse gases, we find that the temperature of the earth also increases. And and nowadays we also talk about the global warming and the other kinds of aspects, that how because of the global warming, where we find that there's a lot of climate change, the areas which were comparatively warmer, they have become cooler, and the areas which were cooler, they have become warmer. So all these kinds of environmental imbalances in the long run, and the coming of the greenhouse gases which increase the temperature of the earth, in the long run will be very detrimental to various species which are there on the earth, whether in the framework of the flora and fauna. Both of them, they are going to be, in a way, some kind of a devastation will be caused to them. We also see that how the lower atmospheric warning which is there, the kind of warming which is happening, and various kinds of chlorofluorocarbons, they affect the stratospheric ozone layer, and sulfur and nitrogen oxides that lead to acid deposition. And all this is because of increasing population, which leads to further exploitation of the environment. And if not properly managed, this may even result in a total destruction of our environment. So how we find that because of the greenhouse gases, because of the chlorofluorocarbons, and how the ozone layer is being affected, and because of which we find that over a period of time, if we will not be able to manage them in a proper manner, then the destruction of the humankind can also be anticipated. When we were talking about all these kinds of aspects, we also talked about the natural resources, that how they are being overexploited, and the tourism developed in the essentially fragile and the vulnerable areas necessitates the exploitation of locally available resources to provide basic amenities to the tourists. And we find that when we are going into the exploitation of the natural resources, then we find that some of the regions, they become more and more vulnerable, in that sense that whatever the available resources which are there, these even available resources, they become scarce. So that is one concern, that we should not overexploit the resources. We should manage the inflow of the tourists in these regions, and it cannot be fully understood in the context of the tourism alone, and we have to see the problems in a wider perspective, because we have to also see that not only tourists but even the local residents of that area, they are using the resources. So some kind of a balance has to be created. And we see that until 1700s, the rights and the rewards of the exploitation of the natural world lay largely in the hands of an elite aristocracy. And thereafter we see a number of revolutions which took place, the democratic revolutions of the 1700s, or the American Revolution of 1775 to 1783, or the French Revolution of 1789, and how all these kinds of revolutions, they in a way restructured the society. And with this we also find that there was an increased access of individuals to the productive resources, and increased ability to use them for improving economic and social status. And we find that there was the legitimate right of exploiting nature was now extended to individuals at large in the society as well. So we find that all these kinds of revolutions, they brought about some kind of a change in the society in terms of the ideas, and how we also find that these kinds of changes, they were very, very important from the point of view of the environment as well as men. Then we find that some kind of industrial and scientific revolution in the framework of the machines and the sources of energy were all they were being harnessed to enable the resources to be processed on new scales and even with increased efficiency. And that is how we find the steam engines, railroads and steamships, they opened the new regions to the exploitation. And on the scientific side, we find that the discoveries led to a revolutionary change in the basic concept of nature. And these kinds of revolutions in the scientific as well as the industrial sphere also in a way led men to explore new kinds of things, and how when they were exploring the new things, they also changed the concept of nature as well. And we find that how a world in which all was created and overseen was by God was replaced by a world that functioned according to the operation of basic laws of physics and chemistry. And the industrial and the scientific revolution, they gave individuals an enormously expanded ability to exploit the resources and create material wealth as well. So we find that with the coming of these kinds of revolutions, these kinds of ideas, the ideas in the context of creating of wealth, they were opened up, and how the colonial period in the worldwide, especially the European and the Western countries, how they engaged in making colonies in the Asia and Africa, and how the spread of such kind of a culture through colonialism and the establishment of the world trade, which we find after in around 18th century. and the Western system of the environmental exploitation was spreading very widely, especially in the regions which were being colonized, and that is how we see that Asia and Africa, which were a number of colonial countries were there, and the European countries, they exploited these regions for their own personal benefits. So what one is talking about is that how various kinds of solutions they could be brought about, and the problems they should be tackled in a wider perspective. And one should not conform only to the environment friendly tourism management. It should be in a way taken at different level. It should be taught at school level, it should be taught at university level, and we also have to see that how individuals they are being made aware about the concerns of environment. Then the school curriculum should include environmental education as an intrinsic part of other subjects, so that conservation attitudes can influence the all activities. And so we have to see that only environmental friendly tourism management is not the only concern, but the teaching or the awareness of the individuals at all levels, whether it's a school, college and individual level, is very, very important. And the environment can be taught as a separate subject, so that the ecology can be taught more formally and its concepts more readily grasped. So we find that when grasping of the concepts will take place, then people they will be able to relate to them, and more study materials in the textbooks, audiovisual aids, posters, pamphlets, they should be prepared. And the objectives of the conservation and the environmental education should also be an important part of the school activities. There should be wildlife clubs, they should be encouraged at different levels, and the environmental education should be included in the activities of the youth groups as well. So this will definitely create a situation where one is providing more and more information, and it will create a kind of a situation of advantage, that when people will be aware, when people will come into contact with the people, those who are providing information, whether these can be the tourist guides or people those who are in the tourism sector, or at the level of the government or the non-governmental organizations like NGOs. So all of them, when they will create awareness about the national parks, zoos, etc., when awareness will be created with regard to the conservation objectives and their contribution to the human survival and the well-being, then it will create a kind of situation when every individual will contribute in his or her own way to the environment, and how it will also sensitize about the symbiotic relationship between the animals and the humans. So all this, when one will take into account, we will find that it will create a situation where environment can be preserved, it can be conserved, and some kind of a holistic kind of a picture will emerge, where all individuals, the citizens of the state, the government and the non-governmental organizations, they will contribute in their own way to sensitize the citizens about the symbiotic relationship between the environment and the humans. So these kinds of steps are very, very important at every level, and how it is the task of the government and also the non-governmental organizations to, in a way, engage the individuals from these regions, and it is also the work of the activists, those who are there to conserve and preserve the environment, regarding sensitizing about all these kinds of concerns to the masses, those who are living in these regions. And at the same time, the people, those who are visiting these regions, they should also be made aware about the important concerns of that particular area in which they have visited. So they are more careful while dealing with these regions, they are more careful in terms of their behavior in these regions. So when one is trying to, in a way, figure out that how these kinds of concerns which are there with regard to environment, they have been very, very important, then one will try to recollect these concerns in the framework of the various kinds of pressures which have emerged on the various important areas. For example, the wildlife, beaches and seas, or the mountains, all of them, they have been affected, and some kind of a threshold. In the context of the threshold, we talked about the important components: the increasing population, or increasing pollution, and the increasing exploitation of the natural resources. So one has to see the picture in a very holistic manner, that how one can contribute in that sense, and one has to realize that these kinds of pressures are also because of the tourism activities. And if one is not able to save the wildlife, if one is not able to save the beaches and the seas and the mountains, then human beings, they will also not be able to survive, because there is a very delicate kind of a balance between the humans and the nature. And if one is not able to preserve the nature, then it will also affect the human beings in a very negative manner. And then we also talked about the various kinds of important components of the threshold, that how the increasing population, how the increasing exploitation of the natural resources, and the increasing pollution, all of them, they are creating some kind of a pressure on the population. So how they have to be tackled in that context, this we have already discussed. And I think you found this kind of information very informative, and it is also very, very important from individual point of view, that each human being who is there on the planet, they give their own contribution in terms of preserving the environment. With this, I'd like to end the discussion. Thank you very much.